Week 3, the rights of men and women. Today we're looking at the rise of the democracy movements across the world. But the important thing to remember today is that democracy is still a relatively new concept in history. The majority of the population of the world, even until relatively recently, lived in a form of government that did not allow them to vote or participate in the political process. And it took various movements within different countries to achieve that. But it's a very recent concept that democracy is necessarily a good thing. And so quickly these maps show the spread of democratic rights across the world, but there's still areas that don't have them. And women's suffrage is an even newer concept. There are particular countries that were quite late in coming to give women the vote. And again, as we'll see, this is divided by race as well as it is by class. So democracy is not inevitable, and it was often taken away after being achieved. We've seen this with many forms of rights that we've looked at in this module. Rights are historically contingent. They're not universal or natural. They're determined by the political structures in which people live. And democracy isn't just about the vote or universal suffrage. It's about the wider representative system and how people organise themselves. And the foundation of political representation remained, until, again, very relatively recently, property. That to have the vote, you needed to have property. To be an MP or take part in the political system, you needed to have land or at least a substantial form of income. But there were new and competing ideas about people's status within society in terms of politics. We could stretch back all the way to early medieval times with the Peasants' Revolt and ideas about equality. The Levellers in the 17th century during the Civil Wars put forward declarations and agreements that suggested that people should have equal rights in politics. But obviously these were minority groups and quite quickly crushed by the main political elite. They did not succeed. So the key questions and debates about the democracy movements in more modern history are what are the connections and influences in the suffrage movements globally? What is the influence of revolution? Again, with the last couple of weeks, we've looked at the impact of the American and the French revolutions. To what extent were democratic movements calling for revolution? Why did some countries enfranchise their populations earlier than others? And to what extent were the suffrage movements themselves influential on government decisions to enfranchise their population? What impact did social movements have, if any? So the first demands for political representation, as we've seen, appear in the 18th century, particularly in America, with this term no taxation without representation. This idea that you must have a say in your government if you're paying taxes, and if you are paying taxes and not being represented in government, then that's seen as unfair. And again, the American and the French revolutions are the biggest influence on new ideas about the fact that men in particular have equal rights and therefore they should have equal representation in the political system. And we've seen this guy and this female writer over and again, but Thomas Paine was the person to really encapsulate that in a proper type of manifesto, if you like, the rights of man, which calls for an element of what we now regard as democracy. Mary Wollstonecraft is writing about women and the fact that women should also play a part in the political system, but she's not calling for the vote for women at this stage. So this what is seen as a canonical text of the feminist movement is more moderate than perhaps its later reputation lets us believe. So the first popular movement for democracy or universal suffrage in Britain occurred in the 1790s, with what were called corresponding societies, led by working people who were calling for the vote for all working men. And the most famous of which was the London Corresponding Society, which petitioned Parliament for the vote. They were quite severely suppressed by the government, which feared that, inspired by the French, working people would uprise and cause a revolution. There were many arguments against democracy. Again, don't assume that people automatically believed that democracy was a good thing. Actually, the ruling elites, again encapsulated by a canonical text by the Whig politician Edmund Burke, called The Reflections on the Revolution in France, argued that democracy would inevitably end up as anarchy and mob rule. So they took the words demos, meaning people, and krasi, the idea of a system or a rule, and this idea was that people were unthinking. Working people who weren't educated, didn't have property, therefore didn't have a stake in the nation, were just the same as the beasts of the cattle and the pigs that you can see in Smithville Market, who were being lectured by one of the reform leaders. In this case, it's the most famous reform leader of the 18 teens, Henry Hunt, who then features at the Peterloo Massacre in 1819. The next big movement to campaign for democracy in Britain were known as the Chartists, and Chartism was the largest popular movement for democracy. It attracted thousands of members and millions of signatures to their petition. They had a particular manifesto known as the People's Charter, which had 6 points, which you can see on the screen, and they campaigned pretty much incessantly for the vote for all men and various other changes to the political system. From the 1830s to the 1850s, had these big, large meetings across the country. But there were also revolutionary aspects to the Chartist movement. The Newport Rising is perhaps the most famous of the more militant physical force, as it was known, where they try and take over the town of Newport. So remember that social movements are always made up of different elements. Some are more violent than others. And the questions over, should you campaign peacefully through legitimate means such as petitioning Parliament, or should you try and take over by force, because that's the only way that you'll get the elites to listen to you. But Chartism is also important because it was also a way of life. It wasn't just a political movement. It encompassed new utopian ideas about how you should educate children, how you should live. It set up its own settlements and farming. And there was a much more holistic way of life for Chartists, which again was a reason why it was so popular. But it didn't succeed. The government were still regarded the 6 points and the demand for the vote as too radical. And so its petitions were all rejected. There's other elements of popular movements in this period that would quickly be aware of, like the rights of religious minorities, or in the case of Ireland, the majority, the Catholics, who campaigned for their own political rights and for repeal of the union with Great Britain. And that was led by Daniel O'Connell in the 1840s. Again, unsuccessful. The only way that the movements were able to inch forward was actually through getting some sort of reform from within Parliament. So the various governments in the 19th century passed reform acts, but they're still limited. They're still based on this idea that property is the foundation of political representation. Democracy, this idea that everyone should have the vote, is still anathema. It's still seen as suspicious. And so we see the rise in the later 19th century of labour movements, working class movements based around trade unions, who decide that the way really to get more representation and power is to form their own political party. And so we see the rise of what becomes the Labour Party, set up by trade unions. But it takes until 1945 for them to actually win a general election. It's a long process. So the women's suffrage movement comes quite late in this story. It takes a long time for men to get the vote, so men have to get the vote essentially before women can start campaigning. We see the origins in Britain and other nations. The Langdon Place group, the most famous group in British history to start this process off, and also campaigners like John Stuart Mill, the philosopher who puts forward philosophical ideas about why the vote should be extended to women. And we see influence of changing ideas about women's place in society, that they are now, married women are now allowed to own property after 1882. So we have in 1884 about 30,000 women who own property, but they're still excluded from the vote. It seems like an anomaly now. But it takes much more public and sustained campaigns by the suffrage movement. I'm sure you've all read about, particularly the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, who are opposed by groups who feel that the campaign of violence and campaign of militancy is damaging the cause, such as the Women's Freedom League, who vow to use only legal means to campaign for the vote. So it takes until the 20th century, essentially, for democracy to be implemented in Britain with the various representations of the People's Act. But it's only in 1969 that people aged 18 and over can all vote. We'll also look at women's suffrage movements across the world, and here we've got some quite interesting comparisons and parallels, and something again that historians are now much more interested in terms of why did some places across the world get the vote for women much earlier than other places. And the very influential and important suffrage associations in the US and in Australia and New Zealand, and they all are connected, they all talk to each other, they all correspond with each other and send delegates and lecturers. The Australian example's very interesting because they're one of the earliest countries, as well as New Zealand, to give women the vote. And their suffrage league presents huge petitions to their parliament, leading to the adult suffrage bill in 1894. But as we'll see, actually, it's these more peripheral places in the world, rather than the big powers, that give women and other types of peoples the vote much earlier than places like Britain and America. The issue of race is also an intersection with that. So even though Australia was very early in giving white women the vote, it excluded Aboriginal people from the vote altogether, and there was quite large campaigns for Aboriginal women in Australia to get the vote in the 1960s. New Zealand was different to that. They'd actually had quite a sort of large Maori democracy movement and campaign, and so they achieved the vote much earlier than their equivalent Indigenous peoples in Australia.